Hello and welcome to the Health Report with me, Tegan Taylor.
And me, Sarah Sedgey.
This week we're going to take an in-depth look at an important issue that many of you have written to us about over the years. The gender bias in healthcare is pervasive, and it's not only an issue of equity, it causes untold harm. It sees women receiving worse treatments during a heart attack, being denied proper pain relief when in pain, and in other instances less likely to get critical interventions. Historically, women have been excluded or underrepresented in research, or the way research has been organised has been biased towards males.
It leads to poorer care for women, and it's a huge problem. So to help us understand these issues more, we're joined by Professor of Obstetrics and Gynaecology at the University of Melbourne and at the Royal Women's Hospital, Martha Hickey, who's been lobbying on this topic for many years now. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Professor Robin Norton, Principal Director of the George Institute for Global Health, and she's also a Professor of Public Health at the University of New South Wales and at the Imperial College in London. She's a world leader in clinical trials and also an advocate for change. Welcome.
Thank you.
Robin, let's start with you. Are you able to describe this gender bias and where does it come from?
I think the first issue we need to discuss here is the exclusion for many years of women from medical research. And indeed, it extends to animals, female animals, and indeed female cells. The exclusion of women from research is a historical issue. But then more recently, as we've started to include more women in trials and in research studies, we're still seeing that data are not being disaggregated and examined separately for men and women.
Martha, are you able to tell me a little bit more about what is this issue of having a lack of research on the cells of female animals? What's the problem there?
Well, I think it was presumed for a long time that there was no difference and it didn't really matter. From the cell line work. In the animal work, which is mostly in rodents, sometimes they choose female mice because they're less aggressive than male mice and easier to work with. So there are slightly sort of random reasons like that have underpinned some of these issues. I don't think anybody has been specifically trying to exclude women in the preclinical work, and in the clinical work there have been some issues about safety in women. But ultimately, if we're going to collect our data from males or from men, and then we're going to apply them to everybody and specifically to women, then there's a risk of the wrong information being applied to women and then women being harmed by that. And I think COVID has been a great example of this. The issues around vaccination of women, of pregnant women, for example, which have taken considerable advocacy, some of which has been from Australia to ensure that pregnant women were included in those trials.
Do women die because of the gender bias in medicine and health? What's the harm?
Perhaps the most extreme example, and one that I often quote, is research that was published a couple of years ago in the UK, which compared women with a heart attack and men with a heart attack and looked at the extent to which both men and women were being treated according to guidelines. Women were less likely to be treated according to those guidelines compared with men. And it was estimated that over a 10-year period, at least 8,000 women were likely to have died because they were not receiving the guideline-based care. So that's a very extreme example, but I think highlights the issue.
Martha, that's a pretty breathtaking example that Robin's just given. Are there other examples that you've seen where gender bias or a lack of research in women has led to women not getting proper care?
I think we have a fundamental problem with the concept of what a human is, which is a human is a man. And certainly as medical students, that's what we're taught. And most things are based around the concept of a 70-kilo man. That would be a white man. So once we start having things that only affect women, like menstruation or pregnancy or menopause, those become aberrations from the norm and hence become pathologized and medicalized. So there is a huge amount of harm potentially from doing that, from turning normal physical factors or experiences in women into illnesses.
And of course, we should make the distinction here between gender and sex. And really, they're both relevant because there's discrimination or there's inequity in the way people are treated because of the gender that they present. But there's also biological factors at play here.
Yes, that's right. And I think just to go back a step about, as Robin was just discussing, the under-inclusion of females at all stages of research. For humans, for clinical research, one of the reasons for exclusion of women was because of thalidomide and the possibility that drugs given to women might be teratogenic or might harm the fetus. That was many, many years ago. But if we then take this issue about women being an aberration and exclude women because they're menstruating or not menstruating or taking hormonal contraceptives or pregnant or have just been pregnant or menopausal, you end up excluding everybody.
Right. And Robin, you mentioned animal research and even cells before. Is this something that people are trying to take steps to change?
Oh, absolutely. No, it is changing. I think there's greater recognition. And so the National Institutes of Health in the US has led changes in this direction. Also, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And it's something that Australia, in a general sense, has been lagging behind. And we really need to work with colleagues in Australia across the spectrum from basic research through to animal research, through to human research to ensure that this has changed.
So let's hear now a personal story of how gender bias in medicine can cause harm and suffering for women. Chronic pain. Research shows women in pain are less likely to get timely or adequate treatment in hospitals. Meanwhile, the majority of pain studies are conducted on male mice or on human men. Here's Sarah Fowler. She's lived with chronic pain from a young age.
I've been dealing with chronic pain since about the age of 10, maybe even earlier. I was diagnosed with chronic regional pain syndrome. Basically, that means that my body was sending pain signals when there was no injury. It often means that my pain signals are heightened, or I might feel weird sensations like burning or tingling, and it's real pain. There's no cause for the pain. I'm so used to ignoring pain signals that sometimes real pain and real injuries I can ignore when I probably shouldn't. I had in year 5 in my first major flare-up, which was really scary for me. They would just tell me that it was in my head and I was just being sort of dramatic as such. There was a lot of times where, and I've noticed as I get older, the same sorts of things where hysteria and being dramatic and being unable to handle pain was something that I was told I couldn't handle pain, but my male friends in the same age bracket would be believed much more quickly. I found myself having to convince a lot of doctors, and not only that, but a lot of people. I guess there's just this belief that people grow up with that women can't handle as much as men can. We are half the population, and I think women and men have different medical problems, and that's really valid, and it needs to be investigated for both men and women.
That's Sarah Fowler, who's lived with chronic pain since she was a child. Autism spectrum disorder is a developmental condition that is said to be more prevalent in boys. But the possibility exists that this is also an example of gender bias because spectrum disorders like autism and ADHD have different symptom patterns in boys than in girls, which make boys stand out more. For example, researchers think girls seem to be better at masking their symptoms to fit in more. It can be frustrating for parents who know their girls need more support or for women who don't get a diagnosis until later in adulthood, like Barb Cook. She was nearly 40 when she finally found out that she has autism spectrum disorder. Sarah spoke to her earlier.
I found it very difficult at times and didn't really understand what was going on. I thought that there was, as I got older, there was something quite wrong with my mental health. I was diagnosed with clinical depression when I was 19, and I had anxiety and I had multiple misdiagnoses through my life, including social phobia, bipolar disorder, and eventually it wasn't till my late 30s that I actually ended up with the diagnosis of the autism, ADHD and dyslexia.
How were you finally able to get the right diagnosis?
Getting the right diagnosis came about after becoming very burnt out and hitting a breakdown. At that point in my life, I was struggling very difficultly with work. I had many lost jobs. I had broken relationships and friendships. And I'd gotten to a point where I'd actually felt like I'd lost a lot of hope in what my life was about, and in some terms had given up in ever being able to understand or fit into society. And it was during this time of my breakdown, and after having an accident in a hospital, I got referred to a psychologist. That was the starting point of going down the pathway of eventually getting a correct diagnosis after many more talks about what was going on in my life and having somebody that could actually understand me. So finally, when my diagnosis came about, was through a professional who was a psychiatrist that actually understood autism and ADHD in adults and more so in women.
What difference did having the right diagnosis make for you?
Getting the right diagnosis completely changed my life. It made a lot of sense where all the other diagnoses, I related to a tiny part of them, and getting the correct diagnosis made the sense of why I was anxious, why I had depression as well, because of the case that I was different to other people around me. And once I started to learn more about myself and learn about what autism was, it opened up opportunities for me to change how my life was.
When you were getting the wrong information from the health system, how did you feel walking away from those appointments?
Those continual misdiagnoses actually added to the sense of despair. So for me, it kept feeling like, well, there is something wrong with me. I am broken. There is no fixing who I am. And when I got the diagnosis of my autism, ADHD and dyslexia, it turned that around. I wasn't broken. I was just different. I looked at the world differently. I felt the world differently, especially through my sensory profile, which I had no idea of, that I had heightened senses around sound and light, which were also impacting on my overwhelm and how I felt.
Why do you think it took so long for you to get a diagnosis?
It took so long to get a diagnosis, and this also happens with lots of women. There isn't still a great deal of understanding about autism in women. When I got diagnosed in 2009, looking for literature about autism and female experiences, there was still even very limited information there. So if there's limited information out there for the general public, there's obviously limited information and bias within the medical system as well, because research has predominantly been about boys. Girls are very different. We're very good at masking. We're very good at hiding who we are. So people tend to think, okay, they've got anxiety, they've got depression, but these are things that come from masking the autism and the differences of who we are.
That's Barb Cook sharing her story. You're listening to RN's Health Report. I'm Sarah Sedgey.
And I'm Tegan Taylor. This week is a special episode on the gender gap in medicine. So, Robin, from where I sit, these stories don't seem to be uncommon. Is that your experience?
Absolutely. And I'm just picking up on the last comments made by Barb about the time to diagnosis. This has been shown firstly in the cardiovascular field, but just in the last couple of months, there was a publication that came out in Nature which analysed data from Danish populations over a 21-year period and showed that women were diagnosed later than men in more than 700 diseases. So what she's experiencing here is something that we're seeing in a whole lot of areas, and why that is really requires further investigation.
For me, training as a gynaecologist, we were taught that women were unreliable historians, meaning that you couldn't necessarily believe what they were saying. One of the consequences of that has been for a common condition, for example, such as heavy menstrual bleeding, where what the woman described wasn't a diagnostic